best one for that. So that what has happened is that there's a team which was led by Romain Duval, who is there, which looked at the issues and wrote a paper, and we thought it would be great to actually present the major conclusions. Let me just say a few things about Romain and then about the three discussions. So Romain has a very, very long experience of looking at labor markets in across countries. He did this at the OECD. He then has done this at the IMF. And I think I can take some claim or pride in getting him to come and stay at the IMF. I think it has been a great thing. But he really is an expert on these issues, and there's a large team behind him. I'm not going to give all the names, but they are there. And then the three discussants. So we're going to start with Anna Stansbury, who is now who just got a PhD from Harvard not long ago, but is now a professor at MIT Sloan, and she has written a number of papers on labor markets, on the behavior of workers, behavior of firms, and she clearly has a deep understanding of these issues. The second discussant will be Betsy Stevenson, who is a professor at the University of Michigan. She was chief economist at the Department of Labor, if I have it right, under the first Obama administration, right, Betsy? I mean, she knows labor markets, you know, upside and out, and she's clearly incredibly qualified to discuss that paper. And then the third discussion will be Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas, who is on leave from Berkeley, who has recently been appointed as chief economist at the IMF. He's not, as far as I know from his writings, he's not a labor economist, at least not mainly. He's a macroeconomist, but clearly we're also interested in macro implications of what has happened. And I assume that's what Pierre-Olivier will be focusing on. The hope is to have Romain stick to 20 minutes, each of the three discussions to 10 minutes. This should leave us 10 minutes for Q&A. I hope that we have time, never sure. If you have questions, you write them in the Q&A, and I will try to ask as many as I can, which may go from 0 to a few. With that, I think we can start. And Romain, you have the floor, a virtual floor.
Thanks a lot, Pierre-Olivier. Thanks a lot, Olivier. I'm sorry, and I would also like to thank you know, Adam and the great team at Peterson for putting together this really exciting event. Let me start, jump straight in. This is joint work with, you know, indeed a team of colleagues in the research department, and you'll see that on the paper, which is coming out today. The starting point for this work is really that there seems to be a bit of a COVID-19 puzzle in labor markets right now. And the first part of this puzzle is that in most advanced economies, labor markets are now tighter than they were prior to the pandemic. You can see that in vacancy levels, which are shown here on the left chart. Vacancies are now 50 to 80% above their pre-COVID levels in the English-speaking countries, advanced economies, so the US, obviously, but also the UK, Australia, and Canada. And even in Europe, now preliminary data coming in suggests they're above pre-COVID levels as well. You see also that this recovery in vacancies has been very broad-based across sectors, including in those sectors that were hard hit by the pandemic initially. So sectors that have more contact-intensive jobs, that have less teleworkable jobs. You can see that in the middle chart. And in fact, if anything, those vacancies in those industries have recovered more strongly than in others, surprisingly. And if you look at the standard gauge of labor market tightness, which is now the vacancy to unemployment ratios, what you see is from the blue bars in the right chart is that they are now in 2021 Q3, they were above pre-COVID levels in many countries. And the red dots show you data coming in for 2021 Q4. And as you can see, there's a further rise in tightening, further rise in those ratios. And they are now above pre-COVID levels in actually 16 out of 17 advanced economies. The exception is Japan, but otherwise it's a pretty broad-based phenomenon. US does stand out, but with a few other countries, right? Australia, Canada, again, and UK in particular. So that's the first part of the puzzle. But why is it a puzzle? It's because on the other hand, The labor market recovery, although it's been strong, is not yet complete. Right? Employment and hours worked have yet to return to pre-COVID levels. You can see that on the left chart, which shows you employment rates in deviation from pre-COVID levels. So we're still below pre-COVID levels, more so in some countries than in others. And in fact, if we plotted that chart in deviation from pre-COVID trends, it would be even more dramatic. And why is that? Is because in Europe, actually, employment rates were on the rise due to rising participation by older workers. In Japan, they were also on the rise due to rising female participation. So those gaps would look actually bigger for Europe and Japan. And also at the intensive margin, we have yet to fully recover from the COVID-19 shock, and you can see that in the right chart. So, you know, a natural explanation for tight labor markets right now might be that, you know, the recovery has been very strong, underpinned by a lot of fiscal stimulus in many places. But, you know, that explanation is surely there, but it can only go so far because it can account for why we would have a very strong employment recovery and a very strong recovery in tightness, vacancy to unemployment ratios. But the issue is precisely that there's a slight disconnect between the two, and that's what we need to explain. So clearly, we have to go beyond just the strength of the recovery and stimulus to account for that. So the questions we try to ask in this work are one, why are jobs plentiful while workers are still comparatively scarce? Second, what has been the impact so far of this increase in labor market tightness on wages? And third, which policies could help ensure that, you know, that tightness remains a blessing, not a curse? And by that, we mean we want, you know, the sweet spot where tightness keeps on boosting wage growth and wage creation, especially at the bottom, but without fueling inflation pressures that it would eventually, you know, trigger greater than anticipated monetary policy tightening and would actually backfire on those same workers. So the key findings, you know, that I want to provide up front are the following. One is that tight labor markets partly reflect reduced labor force participation among some disadvantaged groups of workers, and that has shrunk the effective pool of job seekers. What we find is that low-skilled workers account for 2/3 of the employment rate gap vis-a-vis pre-COVID levels in the median advanced economy, although there's a lot of cross-country heterogeneity, and older workers account for about 1/3 of that same gap. The pandemic itself explains in part why these workers have remained out of the labor market. Health concerns among older workers and also low-skilled workers were harder hit by the pandemic in the first place. Changes in worker preferences also seem to have contributed in the sense that we're seeing some signs that low-skilled workers are increasingly willing to move away from certain types of low-paid jobs. A third factor is the rise in sectoral and occupational mismatch. We found that is the fact that there's a disconnect between in which firms and sectors, in which occupations and sectors the vacancies are, and whether the background of the unemployed is in that same sector or that same type of occupation. So there was some evidence of that early in the pandemic, but in fact, such mismatch has receded recently and now accounts only for 10% of the remaining employment gap in the median country. And that is largely a reflection of the very strong recovery of those sectors and jobs that were hard hit initially. In terms of consequences for wage growth, the rise in tightness has increased wage growth. Clearly in the US and the UK, we find it's increased wage growth there by about 1.5 percentage points at an annual rate since the trough of the crisis, which was the spring of 2020. But the increase for low pay, in low pay industries and for low pay jobs has been much larger, from between 4 to 6 percentage point at an annual rate. And finally, in terms of policies, clearly at an overarching level, and leaving aside monetary implications from this work at this point, policies to bring back more workers into the labor force would be really a win-win at this point, because they would curb labor market pressures while also making this recovery more inclusive. So why are jobs plentiful while workers are still scarce? The first factor is just the pandemic itself, we think. You can see on the left chart the contributions of low-skilled workers, the blue bars, and older workers, the orange bars, to the aggregate employment rate gap vis-a-vis pre-COVID trend in a group of advanced economies. And this aggregate gap is shown by the red dot. So what you can see immediately is that the low-skilled bars, the blue bars, are pretty large, right? There's a lot of heterogeneity across countries, but in many cases, they're pretty large. In those cases that I circled, for example, there's US and UK in there. You can see that in the UK, that group accounts for more than 100% of the aggregate employment rate gap, meaning that for some other groups, right, employment rates are now above pre-COVID levels. And that's quite striking because low-skilled workers were the hardest hit by the COVID shock because they were overrepresented in contact-intensive, less teleworkable jobs. And it's even more striking when you think that there's now plentiful opportunities for low-skilled workers to find jobs. And you can see that on the right chart, which here is just shown for the UK, but we've got the same in the paper for the US, for Canada, for Australia, and the patterns are very much the same. This is a chart based on Indeed, a jobs vacancy aggregation website. And if you just focus on the gray area, which shows you the 10th to 19th percentile of the distribution of vacancies across all occupations, okay? And if you compare that gray area to the black dotted line, which shows you the 90th percentile of the distribution across low wage occupations only, what you can see is that the rise in vacancies has in fact been steeper recently for low wage jobs than has been the case for other types of jobs. Now, there's a second group that contributed to this employment rate gap vis-a-vis pre-crisis is older workers, the orange bars on the left. If you look at the UK or the US, older workers account for about 1/3 of the remaining employment rate gap vis-a-vis pre-COVID. And it is no coincidence that older workers face the largest health risks from COVID-19. Another potential explanation for why they would have remained out of the labor force would be the asset price boom that took place, until late 2021 and may have led them to retire. It increased the valuation of their pension plans. But in fact, when we do more micro analysis for the UK and the US, what we find, for example, in the UK is that those who left are actually predominantly low-skilled, not high-skilled workers. They are predominantly home renters, not homeowners. So the wealth effect is unlikely to have played a dominant role for them. It's more the health concerns. The second factor is that COVID also seems to have changed workers' jobs preferences to some extent. It is no coincidence that if you look at the top 5 industries with the biggest rise in job quits in the US, these are typically industries that have bigger shares of jobs that are contact intensive, physically strenuous, and also little flexible in terms of work arrangements. Think retail trade or accommodation and food services, for example. And more broadly, also focusing again on the US, there seems to have been excess quits recently in the US in the sense that you would expect a rise in quits when labor markets are tight because workers are going to be seizing, job opportunities, right, to move up the job ladder in the hot labor market, and that's, very much expected and a very good thing. And that you can see on the right-hand chart that there's a tight relationship indeed between the vacancy to unemployment ratio and the quit rate, right? But what you can see also, if you just focus on the red diamonds, is that recently in 2021, the quit rate has gone beyond what this historical relationship would suggest, and that residual, may well reflect this rising job dissatisfaction and the search for better working conditions by workers, especially at the low end of the pay scale. The third potential factor is sectoral and occupational mismatch. I defined it up front, so let me not do that again. And here we apply the approach of Sain, Song, Topa, and Violante in their 2014 AER paper that tried to look at how much the global financial crisis had been followed by an increase in mismatch. We apply the approach in the COVID context, and what we find is that actually mismatch rose early in the crisis, but it rose less and less durably than during the global financial crisis, somewhat surprisingly. This chart shows you the change in the unemployment rate vis-a-vis the pre-COVID level, that's the blue bars, and it shows you at the peak and the latest, okay, for each country. And the red diamond shows you the contribution of mismatch using this methodology that I cannot describe for lack of time. It shows you the contribution of mismatch to that gap, Okay, and as you can very easily see, this is a small contribution. At the peak, it was not negligible, 1 to 2 percentage point of unemployment, right? So it was significant. But right now, in most countries, it accounts for less than 10% of the remaining employment rate gap pre-COVID. And that's a largely reflection of the very strong recovery also of the industries and occupations that were hard hit initially. Now, thinking of the implications of labor market tightness for wage growth, first, one thing that's important to flag is that historically, there is a tighter impact, a stronger impact of tightness on wage growth for low-pay industries and for low-paid jobs. You can see that on both charts. Actually, the left chart is for the US, the right chart is for the UK. And just focusing on the left chart, you see that this is a chart at the industry level where we plot the observation time series observations for tightness, vacancy to pseudo unemployment ratio, right? We look at where the job seekers, in which industry their job seekers lost their job. And the y-axis plots wage inflation. And as you can see, this relationship is much steeper in low-pay industries, think accommodation and food services, etc., than it is for other industries. And that's the case both in the US and the UK. And since on top of that, as you saw earlier on, there's been a bigger increase in tightness for low-pay industries and low-pay jobs, then for both reasons, bigger increase in tightness and greater responsiveness of wages to a given increase in tightness, wage growth has increased more for low-paid jobs than for others. And to estimate that, we estimate wage Phillips curves at the industry level. And please just focus maybe on, just for sake of time, on the left two bars. And these two bars show you what our estimates imply regarding the impact of the rise in tightness since the spring of 2020 on wage growth in low-pay industry, that's the second bar from the left, versus the average. And as you can see, in low-pay industry, we estimate that the rise in tightness has raised nominal wage growth by over 4 percentage points at an annual rate since the trough of the crisis in the US, and it's even more than that in the UK, which I'm not showing here. But on average, the impact has been about 1.5 percentage point, which partly reflects also the fact that low-pay industries and low-pay jobs account for a limited fraction of total labor cost of the corporate sector. Policy implications to finish. As I mentioned at the outset, we really need to make sure tightness remains a blessing, not a curse. And in that regard, a key priority is to bring back more workers into the labor force and address shortages, because that would curb labor market pressures and inflationary risk, and while also amplifying the inequality reduction effects of this labor market recovery. And to achieve that, clearly keeping control of the pandemic remains paramount. That would help older workers come back to the labor force more fully. In the US, it would help women with young children come back to the labor force in full, which has not yet happened. Some types of active labor market policies can also be helpful in this context. In particular, targeted short-term training programs that help bring detached workers into the labor force and also that address specific job shortages. Think of care economy workers, truck drivers. These are professions for which the required skills can be acquired within a reasonable time frame and that are really tight right now. Also, given workers' changing aspirations, labor laws and regulations that make it easy to telework and attractive also to telework for both workers and employers are going to be helpful. And the more this can happen for low-wage workers, the better, although we of course know that their jobs are typically less teleworkable. Finally, in some cases, something I didn't have time to discuss, we find that the decline in immigration actually amplified labor shortages, especially at the bottom of the pay scale. And that's very much the case in Canada and the UK. And therefore, the resumption of immigration could ease labor shortages in such cases. And finally, I think something Olivier touched upon at the outset, over the more distant future, there's really the question of whether mainstreaming job retention schemes would help keep disadvantaged workers attached to the labor force after major temporary shocks. that seems really like a, compelling explanation for the gap that we see in the employment rate recovery between Europe and the US. Think older workers, when older workers who lose their jobs feel that they're more likely to retire than if they don't lose their job in the first place because the job retention scheme is in place. At the same time, this may not, as we also saw, this may not be the only factor explaining the cross-country heterogeneity. I will stop there. Thank you very much. And looking forward to Anna and Betsy's discussion and the overall discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Romain. Let's keep questions aside for the moment, and let's move to the discussion. So the first discussion is Anna Stansbury. Anna, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Olivier, and thank you so much, Romain, for that excellent presentation. This is really an absolute tour de force of a report synthesizing data from so many different countries and so many different data sources and giving us such a comprehensive overview of different aspects of labour market tightness, of the employment recovery, of wages across sectors, across demographic groups. So as Romain outlined, just to clarify before I continue, is this showing the correct screen? Yes, I have a two-screen issue. Great. So as Romain outlined, there are 3 questions driving this research. Why are jobs plentiful while workers are still comparatively scarce? What is the impact of increased labour market tightness on wages? And then which policies could help ensure that tightness remains a blessing and not a curse for workers and for the economy? So in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on this first puzzle. Why are jobs plentiful while workers are still comparatively scarce? And I'm going to focus my comments on the US, partly because this is the economy on which I have more expertise, but also partly because if you want to pick one place where this puzzle is particularly stark, this is where it is. The US has one of the highest vacancy to unemployment ratios, and this is the data from the version of the paper with 2019 Q3 data, but Romain's data he showed just now shows that's even more starkly different in the US for Q4 than it was for these other economies. And the US has the biggest gap in terms of its employment rate and labour force participation rate relative to the pre-pandemic trend. So Romain outlined a number of different aspects where labour supply constraints could be playing in to why we have this disconnect between a tight labour market and lots of vacancies, but a large number of people still not in the labour force. And I'm going to explore in a bit more detail 4 of those aspects. First, I'll look at COVID itself and the COVID pandemic, and I'll look at childcare, and I'll argue that we want to think of these factors as probably having a broader based impact than the specific demographic groups that are often thought of, typically older workers for COVID itself and women with children for childcare. I'll then think about other factors beyond COVID that might be affecting workers' job quality and therefore labour supply responses across sectors and occupations. And finally, talk a little bit about tightness and rematching in a frictional labour market. So the authors, I think, very rightly emphasize that a big part of this disconnect is the pandemic itself, and therefore a big part of the policy response, if we want to respond to labour market tightness, is ensuring that the pandemic is controlled. And we can think of 2 very direct effects that the pandemic itself has on labour supply. The first is obviously that if people are sick or they're caring for someone who is sick with COVID, they can't go to work. And particularly as we've seen the Delta and then the recent Omicron spikes over the last few months, and now we're seeing in Europe the BA2 Omicron spike even faster, and probably to come soon in the US, this is becoming a very salient issue. So I think one of the interesting things to figure out how many people are affected by this as a labour supply phenomenon is to ask them. And the Census Bureau Household Pulse Survey does just that in the US. And it's a nationally representative survey carried out every couple of weeks, about 80,000 workers in the most recent iteration. And for all those that are not working, it asks them, what is the primary reason that you are not working? The green line plots the extrapolated number of workers from this survey who are not working and report that the primary reason that they're not working is that they were sick with COVID or that they were caring for someone with COVID. And this is since about June 2020. And the red dashed line is showing you COVID cases. So it's showing exactly as you would expect that the number of people who are not working when they have COVID follows very closely the COVID case rates. And that puts a little bit of a spanner in the works for those of us hoping that more people are going to be able to return to the labor force soon if we're expecting these COVID waves in Europe and the US to continue. The most recent estimate from the Household Pulse survey in the beginning of March, if you extrapolate it naively, would say that about 3 million people say that the main reason that they're not at work is that they are sick or caring for someone who has COVID. Now, of course, there may be other reasons that would prevent them from returning to the workforce in the absence of COVID, but it's a large number and I think needs to be taken seriously. But the other direct effect of COVID is how many people are not in work because they're worried about getting or spreading COVID. And this is the orange line that I've added to the graph. And this is interesting to me because it doesn't seem to track that closely how the prevalence of COVID is spreading in the country. And it also doesn't seem to have declined very much since July 2021. So you see a big decline in the number of people reporting they're out of work because they're scared of getting or spreading COVID when the vaccines were rolled out, first half of 2021. But you see basically not much change since then, fluctuating about, extrapolating up to the labor force, about 2 million people are maybe arguing that they're out of work primarily because they are concerned about getting or spreading COVID. It would be rational to assume that most of these people are older workers who are at higher risk, conditional on contracting COVID. But if you break down this data into age and education groups, you actually see that it's much more broad-based, at least based on what people are reporting themselves. So this shows the share of the population by education group and age group that report that their primary reason for not working is because they're concerned about getting or spreading COVID over time. And you can see here that it's consistently higher for low education than high education workers, as you would expect, as the IMF report raised, given the higher prevalence of lower education workers in sectors that are high contact and that aren't teleworkable. But you also see that this share is about 2% for low education workers, less than a bachelor's degree, for younger workers, middle-aged workers, and somewhat older workers, and doesn't show that much sign of decreasing over time, suggesting that this fear of getting or spreading COVID might be a much more broad-based labor supply inhibitor than one may think at first glance. The second question to which I want to use this data to add some nuance is about the childcare phenomenon. And as the report outlines, it seems to be particularly a US phenomenon, where women with young children have not returned to the labor force in their pre-pandemic trend, but in the UK, in Canada, and in the Euro area they have. And if we look at childcare disruptions and we ask, what share of people have seen their childcare disrupted by the pandemic in the last 4 weeks, which is what this Household Pulse survey asks? You see that following very closely the patterns of the pandemic waves as childcare centres close, as nannies aren't able to come to work, schools close. But if you ask how this affects labour supply, you see quite an interesting set of patterns. So what this graph shows here is of the share of the 18 to 65 population by gender and education group, what share of that population report that as a result of childcare being closed or unavailable, they reduced their labour supply on the left, that is, they cut their hours, they left their job, they lost their job, or they did not look for a job as a result of their childcare being disrupted. And on the right, what share of them supervised their children while working as a result of their childcare being disrupted. And you can see that these childcare disruption effects are hitting people across different education groups similarly, but the responses based on the sectors and occupations that they work in are very different. For higher education women and men, the ability to supervise children while working is very high. The need to therefore reduce labour supply, at least in the intensive or extensive margin rather than productivity margin, is substantially lower. And if you look at that labour supply chart on the left, you actually see that obviously women reduce their labour supply more in response to childcare disruptions than men. But for men with less than a bachelor's degree, which is the dashed navy blue line, that response is still relatively high, and at least it's based on self-reported data, is as high as the response of women with a bachelor's degree. So childcare disruptions may be affecting a large share of men who are low education, as well as women across the education distribution. This, if we think about the quit rate, is also interesting because a childcare disruption obviously may need to lead workers to leave or quit or lose a job in a situation where you're unable to retain a job if you miss a shift, if you can't take a shift, which is a very common pattern in some of the low education industries that are particularly tight right now, like leisure and hospitality. The third observation I want to share is around preferences around jobs and labour supply. And I think there are some really important trends documented in the report of workers moving away from contact-intensive sectors, job searchers looking for teleworkable jobs and part-time jobs, sort of huge shifts in worker preferences. I think a shift that is often underexplored is the effect of COVID on job quality, separate from the health effect. And I think this is particularly prevalent in some of the sectors that actually haven't regained their employment from the pre-pandemic peak. So in retail and hospitality, as well as other customer-facing sectors, it's often falling on workers to enforce COVID policies. And I've put some examples from headlines in recent months of workers facing backlash from customers and in some cases attacks from customers as a result of having to enforce mask mandates, vaccine mandates, density requirements. Tipped workers also report, although it's hard to see in the data, that in lower density restaurants and bars, tips are lower than they used to be per worker per hour. And so there is some very rational labour supply response one might expect that if the job gets worse or if the tips get lower, one is less willing to provide labour at a given wage. Similarly, for education and healthcare, it's no surprise but important to emphasise that teachers, education workers and health workers have faced a much more difficult job, a much more strenuous job than they might have faced pre-pandemic because of the need to deal with COVID disruptions to learning, children's bereavements, online learning, and pandemic disruptions in healthcare settings. And in contrast, for workers in teleworkable jobs, we know that telework is an amenity that workers are willing to pay a lot for. So in some sense, labour supply we should expect to have increased for higher education workers in teleworkable jobs, and we should expect, based on job quality, it to have declined in many of the sectors which are seeing these employment disruptions. So I know I'm at the end of my time, so I'll share my final observation is that with such a big disruption in the US labour market, and this is where this question that Romain raised at the end about different policies, with such a big disruption, it may not be a surprise that we're seeing tightness when we're having to rematch so many workers to so many jobs at once. The sector with the big employment shortfall now in terms of millions of workers is leisure and hospitality. And that is a sector that saw its employment levels fall by nearly 50% in the space of 1 month from March to April 2020. And since then, you've seen it grow pretty steadily since then. And if you look just at the change in employment since February 2020, the shortfall relative to wage growth, it looks like a little bit of a labour supply puzzle. You've got leisure and hospitality is much lower employment than it was at the pre-pandemic peak, and its wage growth is high, would suggest it's got low labour supply and has to attract people to the job. But if you look instead at wage growth by industry compared to employment change since the pandemic nadir, the low point in April, you see a very strong correlation suggesting that it may just be frictional and difficult to rematch millions of workers to millions of jobs in a sector where they were all let go, which suggests interesting avenues to explore for this furlough versus firing and supporting out of work policy debate. So I'll leave it there and suggest that these factors suggest that COVID-induced tightness to some extent will recede with COVID, but to some extent may not. Only once the pandemic is truly over will people who are concerned about getting or spreading COVID or job quality labour supply effects because of pandemic spread mitigation measures probably recede. And the frictional rematching may still take a while to overcome. With that, I'll leave it there and I look forward to the other comments. Thank you for a great report.
Thanks a lot, Anna, for a great presentation. Betsy.
You're on mute, Betsy, I think.
2 years into the pandemic, and you'd think that you would not have to be told to take yourself off of mute. But you can hear me and see my slides now? Yeah, okay, good. Let's start over. I'll hit my timer. Like Anna, I agree that this paper was a tour de force and a real joy to read, to see data compiled about so many countries, many of which had, just very different experiences, both with the pandemic and with policy responses. But there are a lot of commonalities. And like Anna, and I will say that I very much enjoyed her discussion and agree with so many of the points that she made that will hopefully even allow me to focus on just a couple of different places. And what I wanted to focus on was something where I think that there are two types of commonalities that might be useful to think about. So with that, the two commonalities are thinking about immigration and then thinking about the way in which the labor market has changed over the last century, essentially, in advanced economies. And in particular, where was the labor market going after the 2008 recession? And throughout, I raised two questions, like how tight is the labor market? And I think, Anna actually went through some of the reasons to think it might not be as tight as we think. Maybe it's just reallocation. Maybe it takes time. It's frictional. But I also think that the very unusual pattern of job loss might impact the employment recovery differently. So let's start with immigration. And this, I'm taking this from a very nice Econofact paper by Perry and Zayor, which shows the working age foreign-born population in the United States and just how much that declines compared to the trend line. And they find a shortfall of 2 million people. So there's a lot of foreign-born workers missing. That decline had started pre-pandemic in the US due to some immigration policies, but it accelerated with the pandemic. And I think importantly, what they show in their work is that if you look at the share of foreign-born workers in a given occupation in 2019, it's actually somewhat predictive of the rates of unfilled jobs in 2021, showing that it really is important to pay attention to what was going on with immigration. Besides the US, a country I know reasonably well is Australia, which just absolutely shut its borders and lost a lot of workers. Australia is used to having 400,000 working international students, and their students fell nearly by half. They're also, particularly in leisure and hospitality, rely on workers with these working holiday visas that can last 2 years, and people travel around Australia and take all these hospitality jobs, and those were almost completely eliminated. So now let's switch to the fact that this was a service sector recession in a world in which we have increasingly moved to the service sector. And when we look historically at our experience with job recoveries out of recessions, in a normal recession, most of the jobs lost are in the goods producing sector. The goods producing sector has become a shrinking part of the labor market in the United States. And if we even go back to 2008 recession, the majority of the jobs lost were in the goods producing sector. And yet we didn't even recover all of those jobs by the time we got to the pandemic. Of course, we'd had massive job growth, and it had all been in the service sector. And you can see how steep that service sector job growth was between 2010 and 2019. But let's project that trend. And if we project that trend, there's actually even more missing workers in the service sector. An extrapolation of the 2010 to 2019 trend through February of 2022 puts us down 5.5 million workers in the service sector. Now, I'm sure many of you are thinking, okay, that's leisure and hospitality. That is somewhat right. It's minus 2.4 in leisure and hospitality. And maybe that's, like Anna said, it's just taken a long time to get an industry that lost half its workers back to work. But it may also be the case that demand has not recovered. This is data from Morning Consult, which has been tracking the return to normal since back in May 2020. And they still show more than 1 in 4 people are not comfortable dining out. And that's actually even with a pretty steep recovery since January of 2022. So I think there's a thinking that we're going to see a big recovery in leisure and hospitality, but it's not clear that it's there yet. And you see the The same kind of thing going on when we look at workers, people being comfortable going on vacation. A third of people are not comfortable going on vacation yet. And again, that's still a pretty strong recovery since January of 2022. When we think about this, the demand's not quite there. We see the workers aren't there. Is it that they're trying to hire and they just can't find people? We do know we have really low unemployment rates, but the slide I had skipped was this one, which is we still see very elevated numbers of people out of the labor market who say they want a job now. Probably about 1 million people more among those out of the labor force today saying they want a job now compared to where we were, sort of on average in the pre-pandemic period. So if we look in the service sector, we could pick something that really had a lot of people who stayed home. So is this just about the in-person jobs? They became less pleasant, as Anna pointed out. Well, interestingly, financial service workers took a real hit, and they look like they're just on a whole different trend line now than what they were pre-pandemic. Similarly, if you look at business and professional service workers, it looks like there's a whole new trend line and we're not going back to the 2010, 2019 trend. And I guess I raise all of this to ask, for the first time ever, we had an industry that hammered the service sector, and that's where most of the job losses were. Did we have a lot of internal reorganization about what kinds of jobs were necessary, who we need to bring back, and what jobs are going to look like going forward? But the service sector industry that I've been paying the most attention to is health and education service workers. 1 in 4 women in the United States work in the education and health service sector. So when we think about what happened to women, it's not enough to focus on just women having to stay home to take care of people. But if we want to understand why women have been adding jobs and why their labor force participation has been growing so much stronger than men, it's partially because demand for the kinds of jobs they do, and women hold 78% of the jobs in this sector, has grown really sharply for a long time. In fact, in every previous recession, jobs in education, private sector, education and health sector service jobs grew throughout the downturn, insulating women against job loss in a recession. So these jobs are very important for women. They don't tend to lose them in a recession, and yet they lost them in this recession. We sent the dental hygienists home. We sent healthcare workers who weren't dealing with COVID home, and they didn't all come back. Again, if we put the projected trend there, what we see is we're down 1.2 million education and healthcare sector workers. And where are they coming from? They're disproportionately in care industries. Nursing and residential care facilities have not recovered at all and are continuing to decline in employment. Maybe they can't find the workers because it's a really dangerous job. Maybe people don't want to put their loved ones in nursing and residential care facilities because it's a really dangerous place. But when we don't have professionals caregiving for our children and for elders, then we end up doing it ourselves. And that is a lot of what happened during the pandemic, is we shifted from these services that we buy in the market to home production. I think the question we need to ask right now is, how temporary has that shift from market-based services to home production been? And will we all go back to the exact same level of market-based services in the future? Time use data showed an increase in many forms of home production, but for men and for women. And for a lot of people, prior to the pandemic, 16% of the population provided elder care. So elder care is incredibly important here. How much did that share intensify their caregiving? How much did that share grow as we've seen things like people not going back to jobs in nursing and residential care facilities? And we also haven't seen growth in home health care aides. So we put all this together, and what we can see is both prime age men and prime age women have not recovered in the United States. And I think there's a question in the US, and I wonder if this is the same question in other advanced economies. What's the right place to go back to? I've done the most aggressive thing here, extending the 2015 to 2019 upward trend, which is an upward trend for men and for women in the United States. Is that realistic? Are we going back to 2019, or was that an unrealistically high level of labor force participation? I think we don't really have a good handle on that yet. What we do see is that women's labor force participation remains below men's, and some of that's due to this caregiving, but a lot of it's also due to which jobs have come back and which ones haven't. Women lost the most jobs because it was their sectors that got hammered the hardest in the first place. The last thing I want to end on is just there were more things that parents did than just quit jobs. And we saw mothers and fathers made career sacrifices, changing to flexible work, declining promotions, pausing upskilling. Some of this needing to make a change and trying to think about how you're going to run your family life is part of what's continuing to contribute to that reallocation. When we put all this together, as I already said, women don't tend to lose jobs in a recession. They also tend to be the ones that pull us out of recessions through massive job growth. But this all comes back to the fact that in every previous recession, it's been the service sector that has really grown quite strongly. And I think there are really big questions about whether we're going to go back to the service sector trend line that we saw prior to the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Betsy. Last discussant, Pierre-Olivier.
Well, thank you, Olivier. Let me start by saying this is excellent work in my view. Now, I can honestly say this because all of this work was done well before I joined the fund. So I'm not just congratulating people in the research department where I am now. I find it both timely, relevant, and deep, and much needed. Now, Romain has made a few key points, highlighted the key messages here. We have a tighter labor market in many countries compared to the pre-COVID conditions, despite the fact that, as Betsy amply illustrated, we have employment that has not yet recovered in many countries. We have reductions in labor supply related in many ways to disadvantaged parts of the labor market, low-skilled workers, older workers, women often were the ones taking care of young ones at home and not being able to go back to the labor market. And the note also discusses the impact of these labor shortages on wage growth. And of course, this is really important. So Romain covered all of this, and I won't go back to it. What I want to do, and this is what I view as my comparative advantage, given that we have two very, very talented discussants on labor market issues, is to sort of provide a little bit of a broader perspective here. And so I would like to make 3 points, and then some of them are more questions, and I will put them up there, and maybe they can be addressed in the Q&A. So the first one is, if we look across the different countries here, not just the US, but we compare continental Europe and the UK, Australia, Canada, it's pretty clear that there isn't a single explanatory factor for the differences that we see there. But at the same time, there's a good sense that the number of things matter. So for instance, the size of the fiscal programs does seem to matter. Countries that launch larger fiscal programs seem to have tighter labor market now than those that didn't. The type of support also, the job retention schemes, for instance, that goes quite a way explaining, for instance, some of the differences between the US and the Euro area. But then when you look a little bit more closely, it doesn't do such a great job if you want to understand the UK versus the continental Europe. Migration, which is discussed in the note focuses on the UK and Canada, and I think Betsy's slides on the US and Australia are also very relevant. Clearly, that's been an important factor in all 4 countries relative to continental Europe, for instance, or Japan, where migration has not been a factor. There's been no change in migration patterns. And then finally, the tightness of the lockdown also matters, and this is where the US is maybe different from other countries. The fact that schools have been closed longer and forcing children to be at home somewhat differently from many other countries. So I think overall we don't have a silver bullet, but we have a pretty good understanding of some of the factors that have been playing a role. The second observation I want to make is on this notion of job mismatch. I mean, the note goes into quite some depth in trying to figure out whether job mismatch, which is related to the reallocation point that Anna was mentioning, and Betsy as well, is a key driver behind what we see. And we all have in mind the global financial crisis of 2008, where you have millions of construction workers that need to be reabsorbed in labor force, and the jobs are being created in the services sector. They are sort of in nursing homes and in grade schools, and that's complicated. And the fact that the note doesn't find much role for job mismatch as measured by sort of state-of-the-art techniques is interesting in itself. It suggests that stories about permanent sectoral reallocation that we were worried about at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, maybe they're not playing as much of a role, at least as far as what we can see in the data now. And maybe some of this reallocation is happening within industries rather than across industries. And so that's something that could be explored. But that's sort of maybe part of the good news. Maybe we are not facing sort of a type of reallocation that is of the same nature. Workers were laid off in the services industries. The question is, can they be reabsorbed in the services industries? And we don't need to move them from the construction sector. It's a very different type of reallocation process. And then the third point I want to make is to draw some of the implications for what this means for inflation prospects going forward. And here, the note emphasizes that tightness of the labor markets per se does contribute to nominal wage growth, and especially so for low-pay workers. But overall, it's a relatively mild impact on aggregate wage growth, about 1.5% in the US and the UK, where the authors have more granular data. Now, they do emphasize, there's an important footnote in there that there could be non-linearities, that somehow the impact of tightness on wage growth could very much vary over the cycle, and we could have more responsiveness in wage growth when the labor market tightness is increasing rather than when it's decreasing. And I think that's certainly something that could be going on. But this is happening in the context of already elevated and rising price pressures that may be coming from other things than the tight labor markets. I mean, we have the energy prices, we have the supply shocks more generally, we have all of the price pressures going on in advanced economies. And so this idea that we have very tight labor markets and that wages may have been increasing, it's all good. But at the same time, let's remember that real wages have not been increasing very much, if at all. Now here, if you look at aggregate real wages, there are obviously issues of composition. You may want to slice it down by difference in education levels, occupation, or pay levels. And if you slice it by pay level, then what you see is that real wages may have been up for the really low deciles in the income distribution, but they have been coming down quite a lot for most of the others. And even the increase for the low income levels are relatively modest. And so what we're facing here is what I would want to point out as maybe another puzzle, which is a very tight labor market in many countries, and at the same time, real wages that seem to be falling behind. And that's not what we would expect to see. We would expect to see, if the labor market is tight, if firms are posting a lot of vacancies, we would expect wages to be rising in a way that offers maybe higher real wages, not lower real wages. And so the question there, I think, from a policy perspective is, are we facing a situation where we have a lot of pent-up nominal wage growth that hasn't yet materialized because workers haven't yet renegotiated their contracts, haven't yet moved? I mean, maybe that you have to change jobs in order to realize an increase in your compensation, which actually the note emphasizes that you do have higher wage growth for new hires than you have for stayers. So that's one of the mechanisms that that could be at play, but it's happening slowly. So are we looking down the pike at very substantial wage growth? And if that's the case, then what does it mean for second round, what we call second round effects? Does it mean that then subsequently this will have implications for overall price inflation? And here, I think that I want to make two observations. One is we're coming from a situation, I mean, if real wages have indeed been low, that means the margins that firms have been enjoying have been relatively high. And I think there's a lot of evidence that documents that. So from an aggregate point of view, you could say, well, wages could come back up and real wages could stabilize at a level that is maybe commensurate with what we see in terms of the degree of tightness in the labor market. And firms would adjust in terms of going back in their margins towards more historical levels. From an aggregate perspective, it makes a lot of sense, but it's often much more complicated than that. And the firms that have an increase in margins may not be the ones where you see a lot of wage pressures. And so there is an issue of distribution across sectors of the economy, across different education levels and occupations that I think we haven't seen yet play out, but could portend a very important second round effect in terms of price inflation. I think this is what, as policymakers, most worried at this point. So what does it mean in terms of policy implications? Well, of course, doing all we can to try to expand the labor supply. That would be good because it would be more inclusive. There would be more workers in the labor force. It would be beneficial all around. It will also, to some extent, moderate potentially the wage pressure and therefore the potential risk for secondary price increases. Besides that, if that sort of catch up in wages happens, which I think is a very likely possibility, then it's going to put an already difficult job for central banks and make it even more difficult. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre-Olivier. We have 3 or 4 minutes. I'll just make one comment on what you just said. I think that indeed what the numbers show is how tight labor markets are. I mean, the vacancy and unemployment ratios are like nothing we have seen in a number of countries, which means that there should be a lot of wage pressure. I think it hasn't happened because inflation has been unexpected, price inflation. It's coming. And I think that's really issue number one in terms of the policy in the short term. In terms of a general discussion, listening to all of you, and I learned a lot, I think there are 2 issues. I mean, the first one is how much of the changes are long-term changes, and Anna touched on that. Many of them will go away. But for example, when she talked about preferences, is it that, they have to do the usual work plus check COVID vaccination, or is it something deeper? And I think it's something deeper. I think that for many people, just the way they think about life is different. And the attachment to the labor force is weaker, or they'll ask for wages. I think that's permanent. And then some of the reallocation clearly is also going to last for a while. I'm a bit skeptical of a mismatch, even if they are very modern measures. It seems to me that there is much more mismatch than these indices suggest. The other point I will make, and I'll make this into a question probably to Romain first. Pierre-Olivier was kind of positive on what we had learned in terms of policy lessons. What I've been struck by looking at the same data as Romain is, I was expecting that countries which didn't have childcare, which closed schools, which had no partial employment but unemployment as the way to decrease labor supply, would do much worse. I really thought the US would do much worse. And lo and behold, that's not true. As you say, if you just look at US versus Europe, yes, there's some of that. But the heterogeneity is enormous. So I think the question to Romain is the end. In what are the really robust conclusions, the one where you don't have to torture the data to come to a conclusion that that policy was good, based on the evidence that you have? And then if we have time, there are 1 or 2 questions in the Q&A which I'll ask.
No, thanks a lot. I think Pierre, you covered some of that ground, so I want to repeat what he said, but I want to highlight though that, to explain Europe versus US, we've got, I think, really a few very good, robust factors that I think Pierre-Olivier went into. To me, the bigger puzzle, right, where we really have a hard time explaining matters is really UK and Australia, in fact, right? Because UK and Australia use job retention schemes a lot, yet they have, you know, a US-style labor market tightness by now, right? Because you would think if job retention schemes sort of help workers keep their job, they would actually, right, avoid these mass layoffs that I think, you know, Anna and Betsy both pointed out, that, you know, if a leisure and hospitality industry contracts by half, of course, there's always matching frictions, and you're not going to reabsorb all these workers overnight. So, of course, if you've got job retention scheme that alleviate that in the first place, alleviate those layoffs, clearly you would think by now you would have less tight of a labor market. And again, that works for continental Europe, but Australia and UK really are big puzzles. So to me, I think, frankly, going forward, what might be most interesting to come up with a very robust story for explaining the cross-country heterogeneity would be to explain Australia and UK better. And actually, you know, what Betsy showed about Australia, actually in immigration, for example, which I didn't know because we couldn't, you know, only have so many resources, so we can only look into UK and Canada where we find pretty much the same. But, you know, the fact that the numbers you put forward that were quite large, so potentially there's more these kind of idiosyncratic stories for Australia and the UK. UK, don't forget, this was Brexit, where, you know, immigration was already sinking quite a bit pre-COVID, right, because of Brexit. So maybe, you know, we are underemphasized that factor, and we should be looking a bit more into it to explain better those two countries, which to me are those like have a hard time, you know, wrapping my head around. Thanks.
Any of the discussants want to add something? Otherwise, what I'll do is one question, given that we are over time. So there was one question which said, has the COVID crisis basically accelerated underlying trends, or is it really something very different? Who wants to take that question? Harder question for me.
Well, I would just jump in and say, I mean, I think the thing I was trying to say is, I don't think it exacerbated underlying trends. I think it really broke some trends, and trends towards, you know, the way people used services, the way they used healthcare in particular. And what I just don't know is whether we're going to go back to putting as many older people in nursing and residential care facilities. So, I mean, the other answer is the one that Romain just gave about immigration. I mean, Brexit was underway. Trump had already reduced immigration into the US, and so it did accelerate that trend. So maybe the answer is both. Just depends on the trend you're talking about.
Good. A diplomatic answer, but maybe the right one as well. Good. We've run out of time. Let me thank Romain very much for the presentation and the underlying document, which will be available, and the three discussants for really adding a lot to the discussion. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.